Wyre, Conserving Amphibians and Reptiles in the Wyre Forest. The Wyre Forest is on the far west of England, more or less on the border with Wales. And it's always had a very thriving adder population, and the adder population has survived through many centuries of it being a hunting forest, charcoal burning, and all sorts of other things. So there's a little bit of a mystery about why adders are declining at the present time, and that's something we're trying to unpick in this project. So for people who are local, you might have something to add to that. So just to say at the bottom, we've got the partners here. So the project is funded by Natural England, using one of their SSI funding sources. It's also in partnership with Natural England on the ground and Forestry England. And ARG UK are leading on the research, but very much supported by the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And Emma Gardner is joining us tonight. So where in the Wyre? Okay, so just a little bit about ARG UK. So Amphibian and Reptile Groups of the UK, we're actually a network, we're a grassroots organisation. So although I'm the coordinator, I'm very much underneath like a trade union. I'm there to support the groups. So each of our groups has very much its own personality and their own priorities. So if you want to get involved with ARG UK, I always say to people, try and get involved with your local group, but come to us if you're struggling with that, and we'll try and pair you up or match you up or find you something. So I was just going to do a quick run through. The Natural England asked me to try and include all amphibians and reptiles. I believe there's a pond surveying group, I'm going to say toads, but a pond surveying group in the Wyre Forest who we very much want to be engaging with, and we very much invite to join us. So I'm just going to quickly run through amphibians and reptiles. I'm going to try and make this. So common frog is our most widespread and well-recognised British amphibian. And people often see them in garden ponds. So it's the one amphibian that people will talk about quite commonly. What we're not so sure about is how well it's doing in the countryside. We know there's been a lot of loss of countryside ponds, a degradation of countryside ponds, and a loss of habitat around countryside ponds. So it may be that frogs are suffering, but it's very hard to tell because they're commonly observed and people see them in their ponds. There's perception they're doing very well, which they may be. Just a quick note, again, this is for people who aren't so confident with herps. It's a small, quite angular amphibian. People were asking me today the difference between toads and frogs. Frogs have this dark mask marking behind the eye, and they're almost quite a high back, almost like quite a sharp angle there. So if it's very flat and sort of bumpy and smooth, it's probably a toad. The first sign of frogs is often in the spring. You'll hear croaking in your garden, followed by large clumps of spawn being laid. One female can lay 2,000 eggs in one clump of spawn. So if you count up the numbers of spawn in your pond, that will tell you how many female frogs you've got. So that's our common frog. And this is the common toad, which is the amphibian that most often gets muddled up with frogs. These actually are common, but less common. There's FrogLife have published research recently to show that they are declining. So although if you look at the map, they seem to be everywhere, there are fewer of them everywhere, as it were. We've just had a project on travelling toadlets, looking at the small toads, which are very much miniature versions of big toads, but that's quite a vulnerable life stage, so we're also interested in that. So it can be distinguished from the common frog. It's got like a dry, rough, bumpy skin. They tend to walk rather than hop, and they've got this beautiful golden eye with a horizontal pupil. Now, at this time of year, they are starting to move into hibernation. So quite often you'll find them in odd parts of the garden. I mean, I found them in watering cans, but under stoned rubble, plant pots, glass houses, all sorts of places. The time that most people see them is crossing roads during the spring mass migration, when you literally potentially get hundreds or even thousands crossing a road on wet, warm nights, and that's when they're most vulnerable. So we're very interested to find out about common toads as well. Great crested newt. This is the one that you hear about in the press, not always in a good light. This is because they're highly protected, and because of that, they impose restrictions on development. But They are our largest newt, and very distinctive when you actually see them in the flesh, as it were. The reason that one of the reasons they're highly protected is that they're not so common across Europe. So they are European protected species, and we are a stronghold for them. So we're custodians for great crested newt. So both sexes have a very rough granular skin, and this sort of yellow and black or orange and black belly, so no white on the belly. These irregular black spots are like a fingerprint. So if you were to photograph the underside of a great crested newt, you could actually capture, mark, recapture, and monitor populations in that way. The males have this very bright, particularly underwater, silvery white tail flash. The females and juveniles have an orange stripe running along the bottom of the tail, and that's how you can tell them apart. So also amphibians, they breed in the spring, a little bit later perhaps than frogs and toads. And rather than this explosive breeding, all newts tend to, the female will lay eggs over about 6 weeks, wrapping each egg in a leaf. So if you look in a pond and you see lots of little squared off leaves, that's a good sign that there are newts in the pond. As I say, they're highly protected, most common in southern England, but are found in Scotland and are found in Wales and indeed in Cornwall, so not in Ireland. This is the palmate newt. Now, these should also be present in the Wyre Forest. I think these are massively under-recorded. So although they're said to be less common, it may just be they are just as common and people don't realise that they're seeing palmate newt. The distinguishing factor for palmate newt is this bare filament at the end of the tail. And the males in the breeding season have what looks like little black boxing gloves on their back feet. So those are the two distinguishing marks. If you happen to pick a newt up, which we don't really recommend, you'll see that the palmate has a pinkish translucent throat without any freckling on it. So that is another tell. And they also have tubercles on their back feet. So although they're said to be found more commonly in upland areas, it may be that it just doesn't compete so well with smooth newts. And so they're more obvious there. Certainly we found all 3 species coexisting in ponds in central Oxfordshire. So you should be finding them in the Wyre. So this is our most widespread native newt, the smooth newt, which is also found in Ireland. They're also what we call a small newt, so growing to about 10 centimetres as our palmate. They have this orange or yellow belly stripe, but with a white background. And the males tend to have blotchy black spots, whereas the females have more of a lighter freckling. The other discriminating feature between, because I get quite a lot of calls saying we've got crested newts in our garden ponds and they're actually smooth newts. Smooth newts have a crest, but it's an unbroken crest. So it runs from just behind the head to the tip of the tail, and it stands up, whereas the crested newt crest breaks between the back and the tail and tends to flop over when they're out of the water. And I've just put in a picture at the bottom of a smooth newt on land. So again, we get a lot of calls, people very excited that they've seen lizards in their garden at night in the spring, walking slowly in the grass. And that would normally be a newt, and that's what a newt looks like on land. So moving on to reptiles. This is our first, and I would argue our most certainly most often seen. I think they're fairly common as well, but they're often seen because, much like the frog, they also do well living alongside human beings, and they're often found in gardens and allotments. They're actually a very secretive, timid animal, known as being semi-fossorial, which means they tend to burrow underground in leaf litter. So you may have them and not be aware of them, but generally they like to bask under what we call refugia, artificial cover objects. But in gardeners' parlance, that could be on a compost heap, under old carpet, under bits of plastic, any old compost bags, anywhere. In fact, I've even got them basking under my food waste bins at the front. I tip them up to drain them, and then they like to go under the lid because it's nice and warm. So fairly cryptic, and definitely if you're surveying, you're most likely to be seeing them under artificial cover objects. But having said that, I've visited the Wyre recently and I was very pleased with myself. I saw a slow worm out in the open, not under an echo, so they can be seen. Just to show that the top one is the adult. I think that's a female. She looks as though she's got dark flanks. The bottom one is a juvenile. That'll be just one of this year's probably. So they give birth in August, September. They've only got a couple of months to feed up before they go into hibernation. And they have this very shiny coppery colour. So next we've got grass snake. This is our largest native snake, growing up to 100 centimetres, so maybe 4 foot in length. And the body colour ranges, I've put 2 photos in here, showing a more brownish one and a grey one at the bottom. But the distinguishing mark is always this neck collar, which is yellow or white. And generally, if people ring me very excited and say they've got an adder swimming across their garden pond and it was this big and it had a yellow collar, I'm saying, I'm really sorry, or I'm sorry, I'm not sorry. But this is a grass snake, in fact. They're non-venomous and they're also egg layers. And I think this might be one of the clues to their distribution, because I think what they tend to do is lay eggs in something like compost or manure. And traditionally, small farms always had heaps of manure, which was good for grass snakes to lay eggs in. And I think as the law has changed about piles of manure on land and running into waterways, I think they're finding it harder to find breeding spots. So that's restricting their range. And I think when you look on the map, you can see they're more concentrated in the southern part of England. We've got some reports of grass snakes in Scotland, and we always get excited when we hear about them. Definitely, we know that some were released around the Loch Lomond area, and it may be they didn't do so well, but consistent reports are of England, and some of the reports we get of grass snakes in Scotland actually turn out to be adders, so it's the converse there. So we like to see them. I think they're a good sign of a thriving ecosystem, but they particularly like water, where they hunt for amphibians. So there's a high chance you're going to find them in the Wyre Forest. And definitely, again, we did a survey recently and we saw plenty of grass snakes, plenty of neonates, which are the young ones, and plenty of shed skins. So I think that's a good one to spot. So we've gone to common lizard. Now, this is probably the reptile you're most likely to see if you're surveying in the Wyre. Common lizards are pretty well distributed across the Wyre Forest. It's very suitable habitat for them. Much like adder, they can live in woodland, they can live in meadowland, but they're most often spotted on sort of timber structures. They'll climb up there to bask, and that makes them more visible. So you can see at the top, we've got a male and a female. The male's very well marked, and you can see he's got that sort of bulge at the base of the tail, which shows that he's male. The female in that photo is more drab. She's more brownish with the stripe down the back. At the bottom, these are in fact female. So it can be confusing. I can tell they're female because this photograph was taken in late July by our Oxford colleague Julian Smart. And you can see that these ladies are absolutely full of babies. So this is also called a viviparous lizard. And the reason it's a viviparous lizard is it gives birth to live young. And in about August, September, these very small lizards give birth to 6 to 8 even smaller lizards. And that's a very good time to find common lizard because the young don't have the fear that the adults have. Probably they get picked off by birds and things, but it's a good time if you've got higher numbers of the animals and the young are less cautious of people. So you quite often see them out and about. So as I say, difference between males and females, I tend to go with the bulge at the base of the tail personally, but if they happen to be lying on their backs, which is unlikely, the males are got a brighter speckled underside. So common lizard we're really interested in as well. And definitely if you were to see any amphibian or reptile, we would like you to record it, please. We'll talk about that later. So moving on to adder. So this is our final reptile that we're expecting to find in the Wyre Forest. We might find other things. Sometimes things get put places. We get all sorts of things turning up. We get pythons, we get garter snakes, we get all sorts. So if you see anything that doesn't look particularly like one of the animals I've already shown you, then do take a photo, and we'd always be interested to see. But this is it's a small snake, in fact, and it's our only native venomous snake. So they're much smaller than people think. You know, people in their minds imagine they're sort of 6 foot long and big fangs, a bit like sort of some of the movies. But this is a small snake grown to just 40 to 70 centimeters. And they're differently coloured by sex. So the males are typically grey with a black zigzag stripe, and the females are generally brown with a dark brown zigzag stripe. Now, I'm saying that, but early in the season, often the males look more brownish, and that's because they've yet to slough or shed their skin. And so what's happening is you've got this thick layer of keratinized skin, so it looks like the animal's wearing a pair of stockings. And so the only reliable thing is to say, is the stripe black or brown? And also, if you look at the tail shape, the females tend to have a much shorter tail, like a little piggy tail, whereas the males have a longer tapering tail. So adders are a vulnerable species, and we're particularly interested about them for this project because we've seen huge declines in the Wyre Forest. Now, we don't always know why they're declining. We know they are declining, but we don't always know why. And we think it's because they've got very specific habitat requirements, and often even well-meaning site management. They may be lost. They might have a particularly favoured basking site or hibernation site, and if that's lost, then that could be it for them. They've also suffered greatly from historic persecution, and I don't think that should be underestimated, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But it may be that years and years and years of persecution as finally they've reached a tipping point as a species. So as a result, populations are declining in many areas. And we're talking about local extinctions. So, for example, Cambridgeshire, Warwickshire, Nottinghamshire. I was saying Oxfordshire, we did actually find a photo of one quite recently. So I think it's possible in any county, there may be a few individuals hanging on, but generally we are seeing extinctions, and that is why we're concerned. So, is it gone yet? So why do we think adders are declining? Well, one of the reasons we believe adders are declining is because we have evidence to show that. Some of the evidence is our own study, which is Make the Adder Count. Now, starting in 2005, somebody was very foresighted to say, let's set up a national survey based on springtime counts of adders. And this had the objective of informing local land management, but also for gathering a long-term surveillance data set. So experienced surveyors were asked to gather data in a standardised way so that we could analyse it. So we've got 5 or 6 repeat recording visits to each site, and some sites have been surveyed for that entire 30-year stretch. So we've had 181 surveyors surveying 260 sites. So that gives us a little bit of a national coverage, although again, if you look at our map there, you can see there is still a little bit of a southern bias, shall we say. And that's been written up. Emma kindly wrote that up with us, or for us, and that's published there. So what does Make the Adder Count show us? What it shows us is that small sites are particularly vulnerable to decline, and that's possibly what we would expect. So our 117 small sites are showing declines over time of the time of the study. We just analysed the first 20 years and we've still got the other 10 to do. The larger sites seem to be more stable and actually improving, if anything. So this is quite an interesting trend. So we're talking about a larger site as having more than 10 animals. I mean, this doesn't seem very many, but trust me, we haven't got that many. So yes, more than 10 animals we call a large site. And this is slightly concurs with what we're seeing in continental Europe, where they've lost all their small adder populations in countries such as Belgium and Holland. And what they're left with is a few large populations that are doing well, but these are intensively managed and monitored. So that may be why they're doing well. But we in the UK don't want to enter that situation where we've only got a few large populations left. We want our adders to remain a widespread species. But if we look at the trends, it's quite scary. Emma extrapolated the data to 2032, and we are seeing big declines and extinctions there. And that would then leave us with the continental model of just having a few large populations. And this is not what we want to see. So Natural England, NRW and Nature Scott have all recognised the threat to the species, and we're all sort of reacting by doing these types of studies. So why are we losing reptiles? I try not to talk all night. So threats to reptiles. So the major reason has to be habitat loss, and most of that is anthropogenic. We are losing habitat because we're building houses, we're building roads, we're building motorways, we're chopping up the land into smaller and smaller fragments. Where we have protected sites, quite often we have high levels of recreational pressure, which is fine if people stay on paths. But obviously there's an issue with loose dogs running amok. People these days increasingly mountain biking off-piste. And people forget that their enjoyment is impacting on other species, other people and other species. Now I put this photo in, this is actually a sand lizard site. This is one of our rarest British native reptiles, the northern dune race sand lizard. There's maybe a few hundred individuals left living in Merseyside. And this is what a highly protected site looks like. As you can see, it doesn't look very highly protected. Anyway, so some species are more vulnerable than others. So grass snakes, common frogs and common toads can range widely. So as long as they are able to cross those roads and paths and move through those housing estates, they can continue. But site-specific species such as common lizard, sand lizard, adder and smooth snake are hugely vulnerable to habitat destruction and may not always bounce back. So what we're trying to do about that is to work with land managers to have more sympathetic land management. And I'm going to say we've had a fantastic response right across all of our home nations. People are really keen to help support reptiles and amphibians, which is fantastic news. So we've written our series of advice notes. We run land managers days. We work with land managers forums. We work with farmers. We work with estates. We work with golf clubs. We work with private land managers, and we also work with statutory agencies. So Natural England, Forestry England, the Environment Agency, Nature Scott and NRW. So I love this photo. This is Crunchy and his horse is Bracken Rolling coming to a site near you. This is something that a lot of farmers are actually, not with horses, but certainly exploring ways of mechanical bracken management rather than spraying with Azdulocks, which is now banned. So there's new techniques coming in, and even in London, they're starting to mow with horses, and people like to see it. People like to see horses on the land. So maybe there's a resurgence of these older techniques. So fragmentation, I briefly mentioned. Now, actually, the Wyre Forest isn't looking so bad. You've got quite a big habitat block there, but nevertheless, it is still bounded by roads, including the A456. So these are going to be barriers to movement for animals. We know that toads cross roads because we have toads on roads. We have over 200 toad patrols that go out and generously give up their time in the spring and the cold and the wet and the rain to move toads around. But definitely there are these major barriers, and that is already chopping the landscape up into smaller fragments. This is my dog. I'm not immune to this. So definitely there's conflicts between recreational users and wildlife. And we're keen to reduce that. And we're keen to produce documentation that people is not confrontational, that works with groups to try and make people want to control their dog, want to not cycle off land, not as this lady's doing. This is from Cannock Chase. They produce this little schematic showing what happens if you just march across the heather instead of staying on the path. So disturbance can take many forms, and it can be intentional and unintentional. And I'm going to absolutely stress that most of it's probably unintentional. But you're having a nice day out, you're enjoying your picnic, you're cycling around, your dogs are running free, but this can be having a massive impact, particularly on reptiles. They're very shy creatures. They will not be able to bask because they'll be hiding. And possibly we have awful conflicts between adders and dogs sometimes, and this ends up with dead dogs and dead adders. So definitely it's in people's interest to look after their pets. Predation. Well, predation is natural, and we absolutely agree that predation is natural. Amphibians and reptiles are more or less at the bottom of the food chain and have many predators, but equally this is exacerbated by habitat fragmentation and also mass rearing of game birds. And I'm going to say it, pheasants do eat reptiles. Pheasants also eat invertebrates and lots of other things. So I think the mass release of any single creature is going to impact on an ecosystem, particularly if it's a not native one. The adder in the photo, I think, is a buzzard predation. We know that buzzards can get a taste for adders, and this is another problem. So if the habitat's not right and the adders are more exposed while they're basking, then they can be easily picked off. And Nigel Hand, who's been doing a lot of radio tracking, does sometimes find transponders in nests, so it does happen. And cats, I mean, I for a long time doubted a cat could tackle an adder, but we've definitely had cats attacking adders. I've seen cats sitting next to refugia that we know adders are under, and I think possibly they could represent a predator. So again, if you've got a large amount of development next to a site with adders on it, there's a good chance that the cats could be having an impact. And I talked about persecution earlier. Although adders, all amphibians and reptiles, including adders, are legally protected against killing and injuring by the Wildlife and Countryside Act, these negative attitudes continue. We've in the past adder capture. So Brusher Mills is a very famous example in the New Forest. They reckon he's removed or killed 30,000 grass snakes and adders in his lifetime. Some of those adders went up to London Zoo. I think they were used as animal food. I don't know what he did with the rest. He probably drank the profits, so there was no benefit to conservation. But even today, we think these are outmoded ideas, but then you look at the press. I mean, every year we have newspapers that, I won't mention them, but the red tops, they're sensational. They get people clickbait, they get readership out of making a fuss, and they make a fuss as if there are adders on every corner attacking people. And this does cause a general unease in the wider public. And then disease. So this is my general slide. So I'm talking a little bit about amphibian diseases. We're kind of putting a big push on biosecurity because we know there's a new species of chytrid, B. sal, which has already caused population declines in fire salamanders in parts of Europe, and it's lethal to great crested newts. So we are asking people to think more about biosecurity. Now, if you only visit one site to survey it, that's probably fine, but we would ask that you do wash out your buckets, wash out your nets, clean your boots beforehand. But if you're visiting multiple sites or you're an ecologist, we would ask you to be much stricter with biosecurity. Definitely, if you are using nets or buckets, to disinfect them before you go on site and clean them out when you come back. And keep your, don't go out with mud encrusted boots from your previous walk. Knock the mud off, clean your boots, and try to be responsible, I suppose, is the word about biosecurity. So we've got a new snake fungal disease. There's always new things. This was actually recognised in wild snakes in North America about a decade ago, but through the snake slough programme, the Zoological Society of London tested the sloughs, and to our slight horror, they found snake fungal disease was prevalent in British snakes. Now, what we don't know is what impact that's having on populations, whether it's something that's always been around and becomes, if the snake's already not in good condition, then it becomes a problem. We don't know. But again, it's another reason to be more cautious with biosecurity. And if you see a snake that's looking particularly unwell, sort of crustiness, sort of just looks generally under the weather, it's worth reporting it to Natural England or Forestry England, and we can keep an eye on it. So what next? Climate change, who knows? We have no idea what the impacts of climate change will be. There may be some positives, there may be some negatives, but it's a bit of a game changer, and it's something we can't stop it ourselves. Well, we can make small changes like cycling and catching the bus, etc., etc. But what we can do is make sure that our amphibian and reptile populations are as strong as they could possibly be, so that we can get all the other factors in a line, so that if climate change comes along, if it does affect things, if it changes the climate, they're strong enough to be resilient to it. So what do we need to do? We need to manage our reptile sites better. We need to improve habitat connectivity. We've asked for better legal protection, particularly for adder. And we need lots of positive outreach. So we're not saying, no, don't have your dogs off the lead. No, don't take photos. What we're saying is these animals are fabulous. We really want to support them and champion them. And this is how you can help. So I mentioned recording earlier. We have set up something called Record Portal. I think some of you are already recording, and that's absolutely fine. I think wherever you put records, that's fine. Just don't not record. As long as you record somewhere, we'll get hold of them eventually. But we set up this specific recording portal. The URL is at the bottom there, so that if you see any amphibian or reptile in the Wyre, you are welcome to put it on Record Pool. We can then give access to Forestry England, Natural England, and the other land managers, so that they know what's on their patch. Recording's really important. I think it's great. Like I say, it's a privilege to see, particularly in adder, and it's lovely to have that little view and have that good feeling. But by sharing the information, you're also helping to conserve it. So a big push for that. I'm just going to quickly whiz through, she says, where you might see amphibians and reptiles. So we've talked about doing recording, but how do we go about recording? Now, for large countryside sites, we tend not to use refugia so much. I know there are refugia out in the Wyre and that some people are using them, but I think it's always good to have your eyes on and to be looking, because if you look, you'll see them. So on the top right, there's the common lizard, and it's basking on a charred log. The site's been burnt at some point in its life. And that lizard is quite grey in colour, and it's managed to camouflage itself quite well on that log. So it's always worth, if you're walking, as you can see our little group here, walk slowly and carefully and scan the ground. And if you see a kind of movement of something that might have a long tail or a long body, just stop, just pause. Now, quite often animals will come back to where they were. So if you go away and come back, if it's been basking, if you creep up slowly and carefully, it might have come back to bask. But often the sighting you'll see will be a very brief one, particularly common lizards, very, very quick off the move. So if you see it, it might be gone. So definitely the only way really is to go very slowly and very carefully, and also to look for habitat features like this log. So good reptile habitat looks like lowland heathland, comprising a mixture of vegetation at different heights, which we call mid-successional, open areas for basking, and we've got a brash pile on the top left there, which could act as a shelter or hibernation site, and that might be somewhere to check first. Look on the south side of that. So reptiles, definitely heathland sites are known for reptiles. Now, there's a little bit of a misconception here that some of the land managers are saying to us, well, they're only found on heathland sites. So we're going, no, that's not the case. And Emma's going to talk a little bit about that later. But other reptile habitats is woodland. Woodland's really good for reptiles. Now, obviously, dense woodland not so good, because you can't bask very well if you've got very dense tree cover. But in the glades, in the clearings, on the edges of the rides, and again on habitat features such as cut stumps, tree piles, you will see reptiles. And they like woodland because they can come out, they can bask, but they can rapidly escape if they sense danger. So these are all animals that have been spotted in woodland. And looking at the woodland on the left there, I would concentrate on the south-facing ride. That would be where I would start my search. I wouldn't be ploughing through the middle of the coniferous plantation, because you'd not find so much in there. But definitely woodland is a good place. Grassland and meadows, also very good, particularly if they're adjacent to known reptile sites. So this is a lovely meadowland in Northamptonshire. It's being managed for wildflowers, but it's also great. We've got adders along the woodland edge there. So that's a little Northamptonshire adder in the middle. That's actually a Scottish lizard that somebody took on their holidays and showed me. But it just shows that lizards can be spotted in amongst the grass. Now, the grass snake on the bottom left is actually on a golf club, and we get a lot of reports from golf clubs. Because grass snakes are quite mobile, they'll often be seen moving from A to B. Reptiles find it easier to move through grass than on tarmac because they can grip better. We don't often see reptiles completely in the open because that's when they're most vulnerable. But if there is a reptile in the open, it's most often a grass snake. It's quite often moving pretty quickly, and it's probably looking for a pond so it can go hunting. So unimproved grassland meadows, tick. So marshland, fenland, also very, very good for amphibians and reptiles. Amphibians love it. The picture in the centre is actually in Berkshire, and we found a lot of palmate newts there. We also found adders, grass snake, common lizard. Didn't find any smooth newts, funnily enough. Perhaps too acidic, who knows. Anyway, so you definitely see all of these animals in that habitat. Again, our lizard there is basking on a piece of timber, but we've got them swimming. Lizards like to swim, it turns out. I mean, all as well as amphibians, reptiles can swim. So if you see patches of water, don't assume that doesn't mean there'll be reptiles there. The picture in the middle is of a grass snake. Grass snakes swim very well, so it's the one we get most often reported, but people do see adders swimming as well. So this is another very good habitat and also worth exploring, but you have to wear wellies. That's my, from bitter experience, you have to wear wellies. So brownfield sites, again, this is something people don't always associate with amphibians and reptiles, but brownfield sites are fantastic for reptiles. They absolutely love them, and they often move in quite quickly. And then this becomes a problem because brownfield sites are often earmarked for planning as seen as useless or rank land. And then, you know, people find suddenly, oh, there's hundreds of reptiles here. So in the middle, we've got Greenham Common, lots of adders on Greenham Common. They survived the airbase. They're not doing so well now, but they'll be basking in those heaps of rubble and then tucking themselves back into the scrub to be safe. Again, on the left, we've got adders. So they're using those big heaps of rubble as hibernation sites and as shelter sites, and then they pop out to bask. And then if they feel endangered, they'll nip back into the rubble heap. And at the bottom, this looks very unwildlife friendly. In fact, one of our surveyors sent it to me and said, oh, no, there's definitely adders here. And I peered at it for a long time, but he says they're there, so they must be there. I think, again, the place to look is not in the big square blank expanse in the middle, but along the edges of the woodland, and they'll be popping out. And I think what the reason they like heaps of rubble particularly is that stone warms up, concrete warms up very quickly. I mean, on the site in the middle, we've found them on computer cases and all sorts of rubbish. So definitely what looks unprepossessing to us doesn't to reptiles. And moving on from that, we're also finding a lot of reptiles on verges. Now, this might be a sign that they're being pushed out of reserves, they're being pushed off farmland, and that this might be literally their last refuge. But it also provides a very long strip where they can move up and down. So this is Northamptonshire. That is the A43, and these are all only some of the many, many adders that have been found along that grass verge. So it's always worth looking at verges. Don't just get out of your car and then whiz into the triple SI. It's always worth scanning from the minute you put your boots on the ground, because there may be reptiles anywhere. Again, as I've mentioned earlier, what to us looks unprepossessing, that's an adder basking on a road sign. There's another bit of grotty plastic there, and we find lizards on plastic bags. We've even found lizards basking on dog poo bags. You know, they don't care. They don't care about the quality of the vegetation. They just wonder, is it warm enough? Do I feel safe? That's the way they go. Very much edges. So southern edges are really, really important for reptiles. They will, if there's a small incline, if it's south facing, that is always the place to look. So this on the left here is in Pembrokeshire. This is what they call a hedge bank. We had a project there a few years ago where we planted the hedge banks up. So the reptiles actually bask on those very steep sides, but they will move up into the vegetation again if they feel disturbed. So if you're looking at a landscape and you're looking for a place to start, if you can see a little bit of higher ground, you can see a south-facing bank, you can see a south-facing verge, then that is the place to start. And those are the sort of that's where you start, as I say, and then move on and look at the rest of it afterwards. So where in the Wyre? This is about the Wyre Forest. So I wandered around. I had a happy day with Tom and Phil snapping away. So these are the different sorts of habitats I saw on my day out in the Wyre. So we've obviously got woodland. We've got fairly open woodland. So we've got a mixture of bracken, heather, woodland. So maybe a little clump of trees and then some open areas. That's a good place to look. On the right, we've got meadowland. Again, very good. Now, if you look carefully in the meadow, you can see tussocks. A tussocky grass is really good for reptiles because, again, we've got that topographical structure. So Nigel Hand is telling us that wood ants aren't great for for reptiles, but where ants leave tussocks in the grass, that is good for reptiles. We also sort of find them often around rabbit holes and rodent burrows. If you look for that little bit of bare earth, you often find lizards or even adders along the edges there. So bottom left, this is the classic heathland habitat. So we've got land that's been restored or was always heathland, I'm not sure which. Very good for reptiles, and this is one of the sites that's being monitored. And the bottom right, I can't see any beavers, but this is the Beaver Hollow. And again, it's excellent for amphibians. Any water will attract amphibians. And where there's amphibians, there's going to be grass snakes. But also reptiles need water. We find that with adders, they might bask in a preferred location near the hibernation site in spring. But with these long, dry summers we're getting, they're looking for wetter places to hunt. They're looking for places to stay hydrated. So if you've got a damper area of fenland, that might be another good place to start looking. And again, our south-facing banks and slopes and habitat features. So you can see there's a lizard clinging to that log, which I was the last person to see, I have to say. But if you see a stump or a pile of logs or any sort of wooden timber log-like structure, is always worth looking for common lizard, because that's actually a neonate sort of hanging onto the edge there. But any sort of open bank, even if it's got low levels of scrub, is always a good place to look for reptiles. And that's a little slow worm we've just got at the bottom. That's one of your Wyre Forest slow worms, so you do have them. Okay, so thank you for bearing with me. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Emma. I'm going to find Emma.
Can you hear me okay?
Emma? Okay. So quick introduction. Emma Gardner is from UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. She is a mathematical modeller. She does mysterious things with computers and tells us where the animals are. That's the easiest way of understanding it. But she will explain exactly what she does in a much better way. Over to you, Emma.
Okay, I'm going to try and share the screen. Is that coming through okay?
It's just slow. Brilliant.
Just slow. Okay, right, I'm going to make it bigger. Whoops. Okay, so hopefully that should be full screen now.
Yes.
Right.
Off you go.
So I'm going to talk about the modelling that we've been doing. So we've been working on some modelling, following on from modelling we've done in other places. So I'm going to try and go through here. So as Angie said, I work for the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and my job there is about building these computer models that try to simulate how species use landscapes. So we've been doing this for quite a lot of different types of animals and now also plants. So looking at birds and bats, as well as amphibians and reptiles and bees. And so these are a bit like a computer game, these models. So they put little virtual animals in the landscape and they do foraging and dispersal. And we try to make them do some of the things that these animals would do in real life. And they give us these nice maps of where we expect to find the animals in the landscape, accounting for where the habitats are, what sort of habitats they like, not just the amount, but also how that habitat is configured. So Angie said that reptiles, for instance, need two things: somewhere to bask as well as somewhere to feed. So we're trying to make the computer simulate these connectivity needs of the animals. And then, of course, there's this need for the offspring to disperse to a new place for them to live that's different from their parents. So we've been working with lots of different NGOs building these models for different taxa. And this just gives you an idea of what the model outputs look like for a range of different species. So this is all for the same landscape at the top. And it lets you kind of view that landscape through the eyes of different species. You can see straight away which parts of it are important to different species, and see that that can often be quite opposite. So you've got your woodland birds and your open nesting birds that see the landscape almost like a negative of each other. And then down here we've got our common toads, who are loving to use the woodlands especially, and particularly the ones near the watercourses. And here's our common lizard, who don't have that water association that's sort of restricting where they might be. So we find the models can be helpful for a number of reasons. As I say, they can give this landscape level perspective. If you're going out looking in a new area that, say, you didn't know well, you could take the maps to help you have clues of where to look, and then combine that with your own knowledge of what would look like a good place on the ground. If you actually physically can't go somewhere because there's a part of the landscape that is private, then at least you can use the model to get an idea of how important it may or may not be for joining up those places you can visit. It can help us identify areas for creating habitat. So here you can see hotspots of populations that you might want to join up with these orange highlighted areas here. And they are dynamic models. So as I said, they're like a little computer program. So computer sort of game almost. So you can put animals into a place and see how long it might take for them to colonize a new place, or remove a habitat and see how long it would take for them to be affected. So because they have this sort of simulation aspect to them, you can estimate how a proposed landscape change might affect them before you actually do it in real life. So this can be quite good for planning what you might do. So you can draw the new habitats in our digital maps and then see how the virtual animals are affected before you decide whether you want to do it or not in real life. Okay, so as I said, we've built it for quite a lot of different types of species. This is how we've gone about building the model for the adders, which obviously we're quite interested in for the Wyre Forest. So we try to bring together lots of different knowledge sources. So firstly, we have the best information we can find on what the land cover is like in the area, and we draw that from maps that my colleagues make here at UKCEH. Also information that Natural England compiles, various open data sets as well, and bespoke data sets, for instance, on where the hedgerows are. So we can try to represent as many of the features as possible that we think are important. We can never represent all of them, but we try our best. Then we have information on how good each of those land cover types is in terms of providing the species we're modelling with the things it needs. So in this case, the adder, how good are each of these land covers for offering basking places or feeding places, etc. So we gather that information through a questionnaire sent out to experts who know the species really well. So in this case, it was 18 adder experts, including conservation volunteers, NGO staff, ecological consultants, and academics. Then the final ingredient we need is some sort of field measurements of how far these animals move and their survival probabilities, which we can get from really sort of intensive studies that have tried to measure these things. So those are kind of the key ingredients. So this just shows you an example of what our adder habitat preference data looks like. So Angie was going through showing you different types of habitats, the ones that would be really good, and we can see that our experts kind of agree with that. They all agreed that heathland, for instance, gets a really good score. 5 is the best score they could give it in terms of as a foraging habitat. Woodland edges, again, all the experts are agreeing that they're really quite good. The interior of the woodland, as Angie said, the experts are saying is not so great. Down to improved grassland and arable areas, the experts are saying really don't offer many habitat resources for the adders. They're not a safe place to bask. There isn't so much food for them. So the next few slides just talk through how the model actually works, how it does that little computer game simulation. So some of you on this call will have seen this before, but this will be new to others. So the first step that the model does is it takes that information that the experts gave us on where the good hibernating places are, and it maps them. So that's this grey map here. So lighter in this case is the better places for hibernating. And you can see there's some gradation going on there because it's not just considering the land cover, it's also considering the slope and the aspect. So it's picking out the sunny slopes of the hillsides there. It then puts little virtual hibernating adders in the landscape, putting more where there's better places to hibernate. It then switches to looking at where the food is around those hibernating adders. So again, we're using those expert scores to map, according to the land cover, which are the best places that offer most food. So darker green is better places for feeding. So you can see some of our adders are lucky. They hibernate in places that are also good for feeding, and others are less lucky. So we know that adders only roam a certain distance away from their hibernacular. They don't travel infinitely far. In fact, they're a bit more restricted in their movement than, say, a grass snake would be. So we can look at all of our virtual adders and say, what is the quality of the foraging habitat that they would be able to access? And so by doing that, we can then plot where we think the adders are spending their time. So when they're out and about, they're not in the hibernacular, where are they hanging out looking for food? So that's this map of their predicted relative abundance. And we can add up how much food they gather during that process. And then we make some assumptions that an adder who gathers more food is a kind of a fitter individual, and she will have more young. So you can see our adder down the bottom is in a great area. She's going to have more young than the adder up the top, who's having to make do with quite a small habitat patch. So then we switch to thinking about, okay, those young that she did produce, how good is the area for them to feed? Because we know that from the experts that the juveniles are more restricted in terms of what are good feeding habitats for them. They're eating different types of prey. They often need wetter areas. So they have a more restriction than the adults. And we also know that those juveniles, the neonates, are left quite close to the hibernaculum by their mothers. They don't leave them very far away from the hibernaculum. She doesn't go roaming before she has those young adders. She leaves them quite nearby. So they're more restricted in terms of the type of habitats that are good for them to feed in, and also in terms of the distance away that they can be from the hibernaculum. So again, we can then do a separate map of where the juveniles would be expected to be. And we assume that juvenile survival is higher where they have more food resources specifically for juveniles. So although there were 10 at the bottom produced by this female adder, one of them didn't survive. Whereas if we look at that adder at the top, she produced 5 and 4 of them didn't survive because it was a less well-resourced area. So those juveniles, they then have to be sent off into the landscape to find their own hibernacular to live in. So there's a dispersal process that goes on, and then the computer then just goes around over many generations, so that sadly those adders that live in parts of the landscape that are not very well resourced for them die out, and then we're left with just those populations that are have got enough landscape resources to support them. So the model then outputs this set of 5 outputs. We've got those maps that are just based on the expert scores and the topography of the land. Where are the good places for hibernating, the good places for feeding? And then after we've done that whole simulation process of what the animals actually do, maps of where we'd expect to find the adults and where we'd expect to find the juveniles. So I say where we'd expect because it's just a guess at this stage. It's what we think these animals do. So Becky Turner did a portion of work where she took this adder model and she predicted the adder populations at all of those sites that Angie mentioned that are surveyed by the Make the Adder Count surveyors. So she could then predict virtually how many adders should be there, and she could then compare that with how many adders the surveyors actually counted in real life. And she found that there was some general agreement that on average, the model was predicting more adders at the sites where the surveyors were seeing more adders, but it didn't get it completely right all the time. It got it a bit wrong sometimes. And there are lots of reasons why it might not get it exactly right. So some of those habitat features that Angie was talking about, like the stumps and things, are very small and they're very important, but obviously we don't have maps of where all the nice fallen stumps are in the landscape to input into our models. It'd be amazing if we did, but we don't. So missing out those particular features, exactly where they are, means we don't always get it right. And again, Angie mentioned that some sites suffer from persecution, or there might have been fires, or the land management might not have been quite as the adders prefer. And so those little differences in habitat quality, again, can cause differences between our predictions and what really happens in real life. So there are lots of unmodelled factors. And Becky showed that one of the key unmodelled factors was public pressure. And when she looked at which of those Make the Adder Count sites had public pressure reported as a problem by the surveyors, according to what they were seeing on the ground, she found those sites the model was over predicting abundance above what the surveyors were seeing. So that was a suggestion that maybe public pressure might be limiting those adder populations at sizes at those sites. So this all emphasises it's really important that although we have the model, it doesn't always get it quite right, and you need to incorporate that extra on the ground information. So that's what we've been trying to do in a series of projects. So it started on Cannock Chase, which is the national landscape that we first built the adder model for. And then that was followed on by the Secretive Serpents project in Norfolk and Suffolk, where they tried to do a similar thing, but for a much larger area. And then the Wyre Forest project is kind of the third of these projects, looking at trying to understand adder populations and bring together local knowledge with the model predictions. So for those 2 that we've done already, there were kind of 3 ingredients that helped with bringing together the local knowledge and the model predictions. So the land manager days that Angie mentioned before, where there are talks by adder experts who go out doing field work about what the adders need, and then we would share the model predictions for the first time for the area, and then in the afternoon the land managers go out and look at a site in real life. So we've got ecological knowledge, the modelling knowledge and the land manager knowledge all brought together on the same day. Another thing that's done is the surveyor training days. So the model can be taken out and we make these packs of the model predictions that can be taken out in the field. And then also the training days help people to get their eyes in and learn how to spot where they live and the good places from their own field-based knowledge. So you've got those 2 things that can be used together. And then finally, we tend to do a stakeholder workshop near the end of the project where we're looking at the model predictions and also those records that those surveyors, including newly trained surveyors, have gathered in the landscape, and looking at those 2 bits of information together and deciding where would potentially be the good places to create habitat, given where the adders are being seen and where the model thinks they might be in places that haven't been visited. So that's kind of the format that we've been using. So the final slides I've got just show our first model predictions for the Wyre Forest. So this is the area that was simulated. And these are the predictions that came out of the model. So firstly, it's suggesting that the area of the Wyre Forest is a good place for hibernating, much better than any of the surroundings. And likewise, it's coming out as a much better place for foraging for both the adults and the juveniles compared to the surrounding landscape. And when we actually predict where the adders are living, given this distribution of resources and what we know about what they need, you can see the Wyre Forest is really coming out as a hotspot of adder activity, with some darker areas really in the centre. So this is the adults, and then this is the predictions for the juveniles, which you can see are quite spotty. So this is, as I said, the juveniles are left quite close to the hibernacula. So what you're really looking at there in the middle of each of those little splodges is where the model has estimated there might be a hibernacula. So it doesn't mean there's really one there. It's just there's an element of randomness to exactly where it chooses the hibernacula to be. And it's very interesting that we see this spottiness in the Wyre Forest predictions, which actually we have never seen in any prediction that we've run for any of the other projects. And that's because this is a forest, and so it's expected to have a lower density of hibernacula than these other areas that we've been simulating, the big heathland areas. So that just suggests that because the hibernacula are expected to be lower density, finding and looking after them is going to be really important, because for the little animals in particular, it may be hard for them to move in between. Okay, so those are the predictions, and we can zoom in and look in a bit more detail. So this is the adult activity raster, and you can see it's quite uniform. You can see the river coming through and various roads that are sort of chopping through and being places where there isn't activity, but the darker brown areas are where there's expected to be more activity. The uniformity is due to a limitation in our land cover data. So our data assumes that it's all closed canopy forest, but there may be more clearings in there that are not captured in our data. And future runs could capture that. If people have maps of where the clearings are, we can incorporate those to make it more realistic. So we can look at how that compares to where adders have been seen in real life. And these squares sort of encapsulate areas. So they're 1 kilometre squares where there has been at least one record of an adder in the forest. So you can see that there's lots of areas where we think adders might be, but we don't yet know whether they are or are not there. And that's usually because they actually haven't been visited. So the distribution of these records is more about, at the moment, where people are tending to go, either to monitor the animals or to look for them. But there are lots of areas of the forest that it would be great to know whether there really are animals there or are not, and then we know whether the model is getting it right or not. And if there aren't adders, we can then look into why they might not be there. Okay, so we've created the adder model, whose name is AdForPop, and it's been kind of produced to help gather together knowledge of how we think adders are using landscapes from lots and lots of different people and lots of studies, and to provide a means of sharing this knowledge by running the model on landscapes that those people may or may not actually have visited. It can give an idea of where adder populations might be to support discussions around connecting them up when it's used in combination with on-the-ground records. And it can help us to predict the potential impacts of future landscape changes if we want to map what those are and then run the model again on that future map. So we've generated initial model predictions for the Wyre Forest, and they could be made better with more locally informed land cover data. And it would also be great now to find out how these predictions compare to where people are seeing adders in real life. So that's everything I've prepared to share with you today, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
So I'm going to have a look at the chat and see if I can pull some questions out mainly for you. Can I just say from the outset that we're here to help. What we were hoping is to provide additional information and support to enable local surveyors to get out and to feel more confident, or to have somewhere you could come back and ask. And it is really your project. I'm very democratic. I believe that is your project, not my project or Emma's project or Natural England's project. It's about us as a group working together to try and support the animals. So what it really needs is for local people who may or may not be reptile surveyors already to get involved. And as I said at the beginning, what we really like would be the pond surveyors who know the forest, know the animals. If you guys can extend yourselves a little bit into the season, if you've got the time, I know people monitor badgers and swifts and all sorts of other animals, but if you could help us, that would be, that's my dog, that would be amazing. Okay, so I'm going to ask some questions. Okay, does any more evidence? Okay, so Tim Baker has answered the question about whether they're really in decline. I think they are in decline. We've got data from the Wyre Forest from Tom Simpson. I've not presented it today, but it is definitely shown huge declines in the Wyre Forest even. So what we don't know is if those declines actually represent true declines or whether the animals have moved. And so we're not seeing them in the traditional places. I think there were some very good habitats that possibly became shaded. So did the animals disappear or have they moved? Have we not found where they've moved to? So it may actually be an artifact of lessening of recording. I know there were some excellent recorders historically who are no longer, for age reasons or other reasons, not able to record. So it might be we're looking for a new generation to get involved. So Tim's mentioned the red listing. Thank you, Tim. Not sure what's real and what's modelled. If further into the talk, Emma added the data. So we were asked not to share the pinpoint data for reasons of adder security. So we've only shown the kilometre grid squares, but the adders we've got records of are in those squares. I'm also going to say we haven't got many records. So again, support with that would be helpful. I have to leave now. Wyre Forest Study Group, your best place to identify clearings and habitats. So I'm going to put my email in the chat now. If anybody wants to get involved or has an idea who might get involved, please contact me. I would be delighted to hear from you. I'd be more than delighted. As I say, we absolutely rely on you guys. It's your place. You're the ones who want to make it better. So we're just here to support and facilitate that. On the clearings, we had this amazing volunteer who actually in Staffordshire did put lots of clearings and things in.
Kitty was amazing in going through, and so there were lots of sections where the forest managers had clear felled strips, hadn't they? And then they left strips of standing trees. So it was almost like the forest had become stripy. And she digitized all of those. And it made a massive difference to the adder predictions because there were whole sections where the model thought there would be no adder activity because it was closed canopy forest. And then as soon as we included Kitty's habitat data, suddenly there was lots of adder activity that the model was now predicting that it had missed before. So yeah, and she was using Google Maps as you suggest. So yeah, that can certainly be done and it makes a big difference.
I'm also going to say for Kitty, she's wheelchair bound, and so she felt she couldn't help. She was feeling very, goodness knows why. She said, "Oh, I can't do anything. I'm useless," and she's actually been the most amazing volunteer ever. So please don't feel because you can't get out and get into the forest yourself that your contribution is not massively valued. Right. Are there any other questions? No. Do we have any other questions? Do we have questions? Just put them in the chat or put your hand up. I can't see everybody, that's the trouble. Oh, Michael Lilly. Lily? Michael, can you unmute?
It's a daft question, but I've got a friend who's a good herpetologist, but is severely, and I mean severely, disabled. And this want to get access to the recording for his benefit. There's something on my machine which says you can download to your machine, or how do you access? I just want to be clear how you access the recording, or is it automatically recorded? Where do I get hold of it? Because I want to show it to him.
Okay, I will cut it. I'll upload it to YouTube, and I can send the link round, so you can share it with him. He can download it off YouTube.
Right.
Which is the main reason we didn't put the adder pinpoint data in, because obviously when something's on YouTube, it's run away. So yeah, it'll take me a day or two. That's all. I'm slow.
Yeah, it's quite important that he sees, that he's able to see the whole recording, you know.
Yeah, no, well, he will see it. And
great.
Again, if he is able to help in any way, we'd be super grateful. Emma?
Thanks.
Yeah, I just, because you mentioned he used to do lots of surveying, maybe, did he? If he's got old records from the past, then we can also include those and plot them on the map and see if adders were occupying areas previously, and are they still occupying those same areas now? Maybe those areas could be visited, you know, specifically now to see if those animals are still there. I think there's another question in the chat about coordinating volunteers. So the question says, who's going to coordinate volunteers going out to survey on the ground, and what is the commitment? Is it weekly or monthly, etc.?
Oh, right. Okay, sorry, I've got further down than I looked. I'm going to say we're going to run some training sessions in February and March. February is kind of the very early part of the season, and I'll probably pick up with the pond people then. So maybe I could come out with the pond people, and then we could do one in March, and then maybe we could run one a little bit later in May even. So we could run some training sessions. I think I'm happy to coordinate. What Natural England said to us was they're happy for people to have access. They do like to know where people are, because again, you've got forestry operations and also with vehicles. So I will act as a point of contact, I shall say, but I will be liaising closely with Tom and Phil, Tom Simpson and Phil Redlin, and we'll work it that way. But if you've already got a relationship with Natural England and Forestry England, because you're a pond surveyor, then you've already got a route, if you like, to coordinate it. So the commitment is as many times as you can do. Don't feel it's weekly. We recommend people don't visit adder sites too often anyway, because if the animals are persistently bothered, even by surveyors, they sometimes move off. So the main thing with managing it, so we don't want literally somebody turning up every day of the week, because that will bother them. And the other part of the coordination, and we did this in Staffordshire actually, it's just why it's in my brain at the moment, is we encourage people to go to different areas. So it's very easy if you're a surveyor to always go back to the same place and see the same animals, because you know you'll find them and you know what you're doing. But I think one of the things I want to sit down and do with Emma, and with any help I've got from your side, is to mark out different parts of the forest, and perhaps places that no one's been before, or we've got no records but look good. And I'll make a list of those places. And so if we can make a dedicated team of surveyors, so you'll have to email me if you want to be a surveyor. So if I've got my, and we can have a WhatsApp group, or we can have an email group, I absolutely don't mind, as long as it's data protection, GDPR safe. We could start to pick out places and highlight, you know, this is where we want you to go. And you go and check and then feed back and say, well, I found nothing. Or I found this, or I found common lizard, or I found some frogs, or whatever. So I will coordinate it that way. But the idea is to get people away from looking in the places where we know the adders are, and trying to get them to look at other parts of the forest. But for that, I also need your help and feedback. So that's me.
There was another question, who in the Wyre has access to the data?
That's a good question. Oh, there's quite a lot of things from Sally. At the moment, the data's held between Natural England and Forestry England. Now, they've now shared their records with Emma. So Emma's the central resource here. We've asked people put it on record pool. I can give other people access. So, for example, the Shropshire Local Recorders Network would like access to records, and probably Worcestershire as well. So, and also the local amphibian and reptile group people would have access. So if data's marked sensitive, we're very cautious with it, and definitely adder data only goes into the public domain at 10 kilometre square grids. So that's like the whole forest basically. So we are careful with it, but equally, one of the reasons we believe that adders could be suffering is that people might know of records and not have shared them for whatever reason, and sometimes then that hibernation site gets taken out, or that basking bank gets mowed, or something happens to it, and then they say, well, but there were adders there, but I didn't tell anyone. So it's really important we do find a safe way to share information. How are we doing with access to surveys? Okay. So access for surveys is we've got access to Forestry England now, and we've got access to Natural England land. There are other private land managers, and one of my jobs for the winter is to approach those land managers and to get access. So we want to work with you on that. So, and then at the end, I'm hoping we have a land managers forum where the volunteers and the land managers can come together and we can discuss what we found and find a way forward for the animals.
There was a question a bit further up. Do you have any examples of managed habitats where improvements are made by this technique?
Okay, so again, Staffordshire. So Emma outlined what we've done in Staffordshire already on Cannock Chase, and we've created things called corridors, Cannock corridors. So we work with Staffordshire Wildlife Trust, we've worked with Staffordshire County Council, worked with Forestry England, and we work with the golf club. And what they've done now is where we've found adders, they've cleared corridors between so that the animals can start to move along. So that can be, in the case of Forestry England, can be ride clearing. So they've got much wider rides, so the forest doesn't come so near to the path. So the reptiles have got more open space to move in. In the case of the Wildlife Trust, there was a very scrubbed up piece of heathland, and we've taken a lot of the scrub out. So again, it's been opened up for the animals. But again, with awareness that adders were there, we've not had heavy machinery on there. And we're talking about grazing using no collar, virtual grazing boundaries, so that you can control where the animals go and how many animals are in any one place. So it's worked in Staffordshire, that's all I can say. It's worked on Cannock Chase anyway. Emma, tell me if there's any more.
I think that's it. So Sally has offered that they have some great land cover data, it looks like, showing where the openings and coppice plots and things are. So that sounds like that could really make the model lots better, having that. Yeah, and I can't see any other questions.
Okay, but we're here to help you, and that's what we want. At the end of this is we want you to feel more empowered to look after your reptiles and amphibians. So that's where we're going with it. Okay, if we don't have any other questions, thank you. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for your time on this Thursday evening. And prospectively, thank you all for your time surveying next year.